Greetings all. Welcome to Aquarian Diary. I'm your host, John Irving. It is July 31st, 2024. It's been a few weeks since I have published anything here, and I do think about it a lot. But there's something going on that I can't quite yet talk about, and I look forward to possibly talking a lot about that when the time is right. So my silence doesn't indicate that there's nothing happening. It has been a profoundly spiritual time as well, full of revelations and mystical experiences, and in some ways some miracles, some very profound ones, that I certainly would like to talk about, like I said, when the time is right, if I can. This has been a very, very interesting and unusual period of time. And if anyone is interested in a reading, I'll put a link to how you can contact me, of course, in the episode description, or you can find it at my website at aquariandiary.com. The thing that I want to talk about here today, and it's something that I don't see discussed very much at all, if at all, is the rise of corporate power and control over vital aspects of our world and society. And in particular, the internet, which is something that I have personally been involved with since its inception. I first started using computers back in the mid-1980s and was a very early adopter of bulletin boards and then the internet. And I saw the potential that it had for changing our world and all of the important roles it could play in doing that. I have actually talked about this before, and I'm not going to repeat everything I said in that episode. I published an episode called AI and the Death of the Internet almost exactly 6 months ago. And I listened to it before I recorded this, and basically I still stand by everything I said in that. The issue of concern to me is that corporations have consolidated a tremendous amount of power and control over the internet since after the dot-com crash. Many people may not realize that most of the software that ran the internet in the early days was open source. It was all developed by volunteers, for the most part. Phenomenal. Everything from email to web browsing to website design and creation, HTML specifications, networking, things like that. But what has happened over the years is that very powerful and wealthy companies have been buying up many other companies and basically conglomerating more and more power and control amongst themselves. Think of Meta, Facebook, think of Google, YouTube, Spotify, etc. In the early days, anybody could create and put out a new idea or information, and it was basically widely available to everyone. What happened is that as the investors got more and more involved, they started to direct a lot of these companies to become more profit-oriented, which meant that companies would maintain or gain control of particular markets or audiences and so forth. So what's been happening is that the overriding prerogative of these companies is profit and not necessarily serving the interests of humanity or society. So now, for example, if we look at YouTube, we have millions of people who are creating content on their own time. Most of these people never make any money. From their perspective, it's just a volunteer effort, and maybe some of them hope that they're going to make money. In fact, I would argue that they'd be better off to go get a good-paying job somewhere else, doing something else, because they'll probably end up making more money than they ever will on YouTube, and it's more stable and reliable. But nonetheless, millions of people do this. Same thing with places like Reddit. People are contributing their time and energy and content freely to all of these platforms. And even in the case of Spotify now, for example, you have musicians creating content, putting it on there, and getting almost nothing in return. Meanwhile, these companies, some of them are making billions of dollars. So, of course, they want to control their market and that audience, and so they create artificial barriers to entry so that there's no competition. Now, the reason that this is dangerous is because we have companies like Meta and Google who now can control the playing field. They dominate it. Everybody knows this, but many, many newspapers and publications and periodicals have gone under in recent years because they can't compete with these big players, even though the quality of their content and the nature of it is absolutely critical and fundamental to a healthy, functioning society. So our interests are not necessarily aligned with the interests of these very powerful players that I've been talking about. Now, I can attribute a lot of this to the transit of Pluto through Capricorn from basically 2008 to 2024. And I have talked a lot about that. You will find episodes of me talking about that and the shift of Pluto into Aquarius and what that implies for humanity. Pluto will be transiting Aquarius for the most part from now through 2044. There's one more brief period where Pluto will retrograde back into Capricorn from September 1st of this year until November 19th. And that should be very interesting because Pluto will retrograde and station direct at 29 degrees of Capricorn, which should be very intense and should bring to light any outstanding or lingering issues or matters that Pluto was dealing with from 2008 through 2024. One of the things, as I've talked about before, about Pluto transiting Aquarius, which again it's going to be doing for the next 20 years, is that Aquarius, or the 11th house, rules the internet and technology. And Pluto represents power, change, death, rebirth, transformation, and it can show us what is corrupt or defunct. So it's interesting that I'm talking about this now as Pluto is retrograding back in Aquarius as we speak, because I think this is a very important topic. Pluto's transit through Capricorn made it very clear to all of us how power was being concentrated in the hands of a few and not necessarily the best types of people or organizations, or into the hands of those with the highest of intentions. So from my perspective, what we need to do is humanity needs to take back control of the internet, and it's quite obvious why. The internet is how we get news and information. The internet is how we find out about things that are going on in the world that we might not necessarily otherwise know about. And journalism itself, for example, is how power is held to account. We do not want to live in a world where the rich and powerful control the means of communication and what is allowed to be communicated. This is what China does. That prospect is terrifying, and the internet is absolutely critical for allowing people to learn about things, to connect with each other, and to gain knowledge and information. One of the problems, for example, with a platform like YouTube is that content creators are motivated to create content that is going to get as many views as possible, to appease the algorithms that Google or YouTube determine are in their best interests, and what will generate the most revenue for them. And so what happens is that people are not necessarily creating content that's valuable, they're creating content to game the platform for monetary reward. I personally know of many channels on YouTube that have very few followers, but where the content is actually very high caliber, but the nature of the content doesn't get elevated based on YouTube's lowest common denominator algorithms. And to me, this is extremely problematic because what happens is that basically the fluff, the garbage, the superficial, the sensational junk floats to the top often. Not always, but often. And it's also very hard for any content creators that don't fit within the mold of YouTube to gain exposure or attention. And so they will languish or eventually just give up and move on. That's not how the internet should actually work. There's also the social component of the internet. There was a time in the early days where Facebook was a great platform for making social connections. I made many who are still my friends today, where we were aligned around political and social issues. Well, forget that. That just doesn't happen anymore. Facebook has been monetized so much that they've basically squeezed out any real value from that platform. So it's no longer a service. And then, of course, consider what happened to Twitter. One delinquent weirdo billionaire comes along, and within very short order, the platform is virtually useless. This should be very frightening. Twitter used to serve a worthwhile purpose, and now it's just garbage. Completely garbage. And then, of course, the other thing is that a lot of the people who are getting phenomenally enriched, the billionaires and the billionaire investors, as we're finding out, a lot of them are truly horrible people, or at least not the kind of people we want determining important features or functions of society based on their own perverted or distorted worldviews. This is also very scary. In fact, a lot of these creepy and weird people are utilizing the obscene amounts of profits they are making off the public commons to fund anti-democratic parties and politicians who are intent on imposing some kind of dystopic, neo-feudalistic, authoritarian system of governance on the rest of us. And for the most part, we're just letting them do it. We're just letting them get away with it. It's really mind-boggling when you think about it. Like, who the hell are these people, and why are they calling the shots about something as critical as the internet? This is not survival of the fittest, it is survival of the most deranged. And a society that lets that happen is pretty much crazy, if not nihilistic. One of the problems here is that governments are completely inept when it comes to controlling these kinds of things, because politicians seem to be completely clueless about how the internet actually works and what all of these kinds of issues imply. Plus, they're often motivated to appease wealthy donors. So we have a real conundrum on our hands. What we really need to do is go back to some kind of an open source model where we block out these huge players who are just motivated purely by profit or greed, and we take control back over the basic systems of the internet. Most people probably don't realize that every aspect of the internet now is extremely complex, and you now need to be extremely knowledgeable to play with these kinds of things, and therefore only very powerful corporations can afford to hire the kinds of people who can manage and create these systems, and as far as I'm concerned, that's intentional. It sets a bar higher than your average person can meet. And again, they get more and more control over the internet. So if you're concerned about democracy and freedom and human rights and environmental rights or justice or so forth, you should be very, very concerned about what's happening or isn't happening with the internet. If we lose control of it to very powerful and wealthy corporate interests, it could set us back generations. And I'm not being hyperbolic. This whole thing is of great concern to me. I don't know exactly how we will solve this, but it should be a top priority. And there should be people within, say, for example, the Democratic Party, who are really on top of this and take this extremely seriously. We have allowed corporations to take over what are fundamentally important and mission-critical assets of society. This should be a very top-level concern for anybody who cares about the kinds of things I've been talking about. And alarmingly, almost nobody talks about this. That's what freaks me out the most. For more detail, check the episode description for other episodes or articles that are related or that I mentioned. And if you're interested in a reading with me, I'll put a link to that as well. I have a 15% off special on currently. Many sincere thanks to everyone who supports me, especially my YouTube members. Thank you very much. Take care, all the best, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.